Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. This is part 5 of our Mr. McMahon documentary coverage. This will be the final sort of review of the content, and this is living the gimmick. Vince McMahon becoming Mr. McMahon and not really recognizing that the two have melded, and how he looks at himself, his legacy, and what he has done. So this entire documentary is about Vince, and yet in some sense it's not really enough Vince McMahon in it. Clearly he stopped participating at some point in 2021 or 2022, and so the entire 6th episode is made up of talking heads talking about Vince, but basically just talking about the issues surrounding Vince. And Vince is not there. But through the first 5 episodes, you get a really good sense of who Vince McMahon is as a cold, detached father, a cold, detached businessman, yet somebody who is passionate about defending his work and has a desire to enjoy himself and have fun with his creation. But you also get the sense that he's kind of in a Michael Jackson, Willy Wonka kind of situation. If you want to go fiction, Willy Wonka is a great example. If you want to go real life, Michael Jackson is a great example. These are people who are, very famous, but mostly shut-ins, built their own world where the oddball things that they do are normal to them, but completely and totally abnormal to other people. When you look at Michael Jackson's a really good example. He came from being abused as a kid, and essentially feeling like his childhood was taken away from him. And so as an adult, he got to do all the things that he never got to do as a child. They called it Peter Pan syndrome, where he never really growed up. And so when Michael Jackson started getting into legal troubles, you started seeing how weird the world of Michael Jackson is, that he has a pet monkey and he's got like an amusement park on his property and he lets children sleep in his bedroom. And you're like, whoa, what is this? This is all very strange stuff, but it's strange to people on the outside. It's not strange to him. To him, this is just what he wanted to do. It's completely and totally innocent. It's not that big a deal. If you've ever seen the Willy Wonka movie, Willy Wonka is essentially a shut-in who lives in a castle, who makes candy all day. He has midget servants, not quite slaves, but servants. And everything is edible in the house. You can lick the walls and you can eat the flowers and all this kind of stuff. And it's very strange. But, it's all about temptation to a degree. Willy Wonka is, when he brings other people in, they're surrounded by temptation. There's candy everywhere. So when you bring children in there, there's candy everywhere. Michael Jackson, similar thing. When you bring children there, there's everything that a child could want there. And so in a sense, WWE is kind of the same way. There's heroes and villains and everything that a child could imagine exists within the world of the WWE. And the person who created that world, even though he didn't technically create the company, he, inherited / bought the company, but it was completely and totally remade under Vince McMahon. And as a guy who had a very rough childhood himself, the idea being that Vince created this world where he was the king and he had full control and he could use people as pawns or rooks or bishops as he so desired. That narrative takes over. And that becomes sort of the dominant narrative of the documentary, is that Vince McMahon is cold and distant and basically manipulates and uses people as he wishes. So that's one sort of perception of Vince McMahon that I noticed and that I understand. But there's another sort of, and it's still the same along those lines of being distant from reality. As Vince, throughout the story, kind of denies sort of basic reality, you know, the abuse cycle. Vince McMahon was abused as a child. It's been reported that he was abused by his stepfather a lot and that he was abused by his mother. And in sociology, there's the abuse cycle that, what they colloquially say is hurt people hurt people. And Vince completely denies it, says that it's not real. He has consistently said this. So it's not like he's a old demented man, but it's also in his Playboy article that he says he doesn't view his childhood as an excuse for negative behaviors. And he also says this about Chris Benoit and CTE, where he basically says, no, Chris Benoit is a monster. He went nuts. He denies that CTE had any real connection to Chris Benoit's change in behavior. And so you see that he has sort of an extreme personal responsibility perception. And as a libertarian, I can appreciate that. You are a person who makes decisions. You are not but to say that past exposure to trauma or exposure to violence doesn't make you more comfortable with it and comfortable with things like confrontation. And that can decide how you end up in certain situations or, how you perceive the world. That would be false. We all know that people who are abused, they typically have some kind of psychological damage. They suffer through trauma as they go through life, especially if it's things that they don't deal with. And we learned through this documentary that Vince has a lot of trauma that he went through as a youngster: sexual abuse, mental abuse, physical abuse, that he just completely and totally ignores. And people are not used to guys who were born in like 1946 having interviews and talking about their backstory and not being inundated with that's how the world was, or I didn't know I needed to go to therapy, or blah, 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 blah. The therapy culture. They don't live through that. And when you look at how Vince behaves and some of the things that he says, you tend to forget you're talking to a dinosaur. He's not one of these effete males who, cries at movies and is some of these male feminists out here. This is not who Vince McMahon is. These things are difficult for him to change through. When you're pitching the idea of there being a women's main event of WrestleMania or something like that, and he's resistant to it, it's not because he's a misogynist. The fucking guy was born in 1946. It could never be an idea that a woman, especially a black woman, would main event the biggest show of the year. So the fact that he would even go through with it shows that he has the ability to adapt. And that adaptation allows him to reject certain things that are fundamentally true, such as that he was abused as a youngster and maybe became a bit of a bully and an abuser when he got older, as a way of dealing with confrontation or dealing with other people. And of course, this stuff is just armchair psychology. It's not real. We've sat down and talked with Vince. In a previous episode, I kind of suggested that maybe Vince has some kind of neurological disorder of his own. He was getting hit in the head with chairs and shovels and stuff like that, just like the boys were. And perhaps he may even have CTE or some other kind of brain damage that may have affected his behavior. So in one of the episodes, I believe it was episode 6, he started talking about having 2 computers in his head. And sometimes they work against him. And one of these computers is talking to you right now, and the other computer is thinking about having fun and lots of sex or something. And this is put in there, and it's weird. the placement of it, because this is the episode where they're going to start talking about the sexual assault lawsuits and the NDAs and stuff like this. So it was primed to make you think like, okay, this guy's a freak. Again, to him, it's normal. And he says that he just wanted to be normal, but this is who he is, so he just has to deal with it. Again, you're talking about a situation where this guy was abused as a youngster, mentally and physically. It's causing some kind of damage in his thought process, disorganized thoughts. But he deals with it. He doesn't, therapy, no time for it. Medication, forget about it. This is a guy who was born right around the Second World War. They didn't grow up in a world of, you have a problem, here's a pill. It was, no matter what your damage is, what your problem is, you're still responsible for yourself. And you have to make better decisions. And that, of course, that kind of extreme ownership of everything, where you have all the excuses in the world, where, guys like R. Kelly made these excuses. Well, I was abused as a kid, or, or whatever the case may be. It becomes an excuse when you do something wrong. But for Vince, he doesn't let it become an excuse. So he doesn't even let you defend him using that stuff. You can't be like, well, Vince was abused as a child, so maybe, he's an abuser as an adult, the cycle of violence. Or, Vince probably has CTE, it is changing his behavior, making him do weird things like grow a mustache and dye his hair. And you're like, no, because that's not what he would want. He wants to tell everybody what he did was not wrong. Or he's not a bad person. But again, Willy Wonka syndrome, the Michael Jackson syndrome, the stuff that you're doing is awkward. Having your daughter in sexual situations on television. Yes, we know that in Hollywood, it's normal, but the average person is not in Hollywood. The average person cannot imagine putting their daughter in sexually objectionable situations on television. The average person can't imagine you pitching the idea of being the father of your own daughter's child. These things are weird. These things are abnormal. But to him, he can laugh it off because to him it's a joke. But to everybody else, they're looking at it in the context of all the other stuff. So as you listen to Vince, the first thing I had to recognize is, as I say on this channel, the obvious story is the one you can see. You're looking at a man who's almost 80 years old. So you're looking at a guy who has poured his entire life into this business. He's almost 80 years old. The concept that he might have trauma or some kind of brain damage or whatever due to steroid abuse, maybe drugs, alcohol, cocaine, getting hit in the head with steel chairs, and all these sorts of things. That stuff comes along with him just being old. You already start having neurological difficulties as you age. But then when you add on top that he used steroids for years, then you add on top that he was abused as a child. Then you add on top that he went into the business of falling down and getting hit in the head with weapons. He might be a little different in his thought process and a little different in terms of how he perceives the world. So that's just from a physical and psychological situation where he could control the violence that is directed towards him in WWE. So yes, he could put himself through these incredibly humiliating situations where he's getting his hair cut and it's for our entertainment. He's, pissing on himself for our entertainment. He's taking stunners and he's getting beat up by every wrestler in the world. Elbow drops from the top of the ladder. This is all violence against himself, but he can control it. As opposed to when he couldn't control it from his stepfather and his mother, apparently. So that's just his childhood, as he is willing to share it, how it might affect his adulthood as he's willing to share it. But of course, during his teen years, he's spending time with his dad, and they don't have a really close relationship. He talks about, the very few times his dad told him he loved him, and not enough hugs, not enough, emotion. Again, these are old men. If Vince was born near the end of the Second World War, how old is his father? Right? So these are not emotionally clingy men. This is a different world that these people were born into and raised into. And seemingly, from our understanding, his father had no real contact with him at all before the two of them met when Vince was 12. And that can shape a person. That can affect a person, especially affects how they become as parents. Now, one of the things that I've seen online is how people juxtapose Vince and Shane. And they say, when you look at Shane with his children, how close he is with them, how involved he is with them. And he kind of broke the cycle. It's like, yeah, but Shane was born in the 70s when all that stuff started to come in about, cold, distant fathers and, therapy culture and all this kind of stuff. This stuff didn't exist for Vince. That would have had to been an adaptation, but he was an adult by the time all this stuff happened, had children of his own, had a business to run that was incredibly time consuming. He's got to manage 200 other personalities. He doesn't have time for this kind of stuff, especially when he realizes and really thinks that he can work through it on his own, that he can do it himself. And he's got incredible pride and ambition and drive. And one of the other things that I find that I keep hearing is that he doesn't look backwards. He doesn't reflect. And that could also be an interesting scenario when it comes to Vince. Because what kind of person doesn't reflect on the past, doesn't think about how things could have been done better? So he talks about not allowing failure to fester, which is a positive. Quite a few people, especially wrestling fans who love to talk about how, the XFL failed, or the hotel and the casino failed, and Pro failed, and he tried to do a boxing fight and that failed, and Evel Knievel failed, and all these business ventures ended up being a failure. And what I see, because I probably have a little bit of a different brain, is that he was an individual who tried a lot of different things. He was ambitious. Being a wrestling promoter was just one thing that he did. He wanted to be a promoter of other things. He wanted to grow. And this is another big thing with Vince, is that he's 80 years old, but he doesn't feel like he's, set in his ways, that he can't adapt, that there's no new challenges in life. And I really inspire by that. I'm inspired by that, because so many old people are kind of like, I've already done it. Now I'm sitting in the lap of luxury or whatever, enjoying the fruits of my labor. And he's kind of like, well, no, I'm still alive. Today is a day to do something different. Let's try this. Let's try that. And if you have success in one realm, you do try to use that success in other realms. Now, the problem with that is that Vince McMahon's Willy Wonka. He's Michael Jackson in a sense. He tries to turn everything into what the thing that he already has is. He tries to turn football into the WWF, restaurants into the WWF, bodybuilding into the WWF. And that stuff doesn't work across other genres, and it doesn't work in other industries. The Vince McMahon flavor of entertainment doesn't work outside of the WWF, and maybe that was his ego. They made him think, well, everybody loves everything that I do. Let me put my spin on this or my spin on that. And there's some element of positive to it, because again, like I said, it's ambitious, and you should always try to do something different with your life. But to other people on the outside, you're just racking up L's. Oh, you tried this and it didn't work. Oh, you tried this and it didn't work. Oh, you tried this and it didn't work. But to him, he's like, I tried all these things because I was in a position to try all of these things. The number one wrestling promoter, making money hand over fist. I got money to waste on casinos. I got money to waste on hotels and football leagues. I got money to waste on my wife running for office. Because you're successful, you can do more. And that's the fundamental nature of the capitalist country, is that if you're successful in one venture, you can branch out. Now, I wish he would have branched out in ways that are more charitable and not in trying to recreate the NFL. But, you know, he doesn't allow failure to fester. But that's the one positive thing that I can say, is he's incredibly ambitious, and that's very inspiring, because you don't really see a lot of ambitious people anymore. Most people are extremely happy, having one stream of income, one thing that they're good at, and that's that. They want to get rich quick scheme, and that's that. They're not looking to build anything. They just want to jump in while it's already built and keep the machine going. And when you look at what Vince did with the WWF, he completely remade it. When people talk about how he got the company, he got a sweetheart deal, blah, 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 blah. In 3 years, it was a completely different company. He took something that already existed and restructured it, essentially. That's why he keeps up this narrative about the smoky buildings and cigar chomping audience and all this kind of stuff, because to him, that's what it was. It wasn't the bright lights. It wasn't the big city. It wasn't mainstream. It wasn't Hollywood. It wasn't New York. There weren't tons of celebrities and all this kind of stuff. This was his vision of the pro wrestling space. And while it's not historically accurate, you're still talking about somebody who, again, Willy Wonka, Michael Jackson, Hugh Hefner is another good one that I didn't use before. But he created his own reality where he's king shit and he makes the rules. So that's all very interesting. Vince being inspired by Dr. Jerry Graham, and this kind of informing his wrestling character. Vince's sort of inspiration of Dr. Jerry Graham is famous, but when you look at, Jerry Graham, another one of those proto Ric Flair kind of guys, who big money, big and muscular, blonde, strutting, charismatic. Vince always looked up to him. Spent a little bit of time with him as a wrestler in the 50s or whatever. Didn't get to spend a lot of time with him, but he made an impression on Vince. And Vince was always kind of like, that's what I wanted to be. He wanted to be a wrestler. And he tells a little bit of the story of his dad telling him, don't get into the wrestling space. His dad forbid him from becoming a wrestler. But once his dad was gone, and now it's, 1998, and there's a perception out there that Vince is the worst person in the world because of what happened with Brett. Because of, if you're in the know in 98, the Rita Chatterton thing. And there's the Ring Boy scandal and a bunch of stuff. There's a bunch of heat on Vince already. And so there's no longer a need for a surrogate in, Ted DiBiase, which is kind of I hate to use an anime thing, but it's kind of like a Kami Piccolo situation where Vince split himself into Vince McMahon and Ted DiBiase, and Ted DiBiase got to go and make all this money as the $1 Million Man and live that lifestyle that Vince saw with Dr. Jerry Graham, and had another wrestler live that lifestyle. He says, well, I don't need to do that anymore. I can reinsert that into myself, and I can do that. Now, I could be the $1 Million Man because that's what I am anyway. The character is based on him, so why don't he just do it? Now he's an on-screen character, unwillingly to a degree because of the Bret Hart situation. But now there's a ton of heat on Vince. And since Ted DiBiase was based on him anyway, and Ted DiBiase is gone, well, he has to reinsert that back into himself. Now he gets to be the $1 Million Man. but it's more real to him because he was the $1 million man anyway. So now you got this fully formed corporate monster, and he has to find new ways of abusing the talent and treating people like shit. And it comes easy to him because he knows, as he says, the kind of people that he doesn't like. He grew up poor. He says rich people always act like they're better than you. So that's what he did, And some people tend to believe this persona is how he really is. And because people believe it, the character is believable. And because Vince McMahon is constantly talking about having affairs, then when Vince McMahon starts, kissing on the girls, it becomes believable. And you look at this sort of thing where now we're looking at everything with fresh eyeballs, tainted through sex trafficking lawsuits. And we're looking at a situation where we're saying, my God, he did angles with Trish, and he did angles with Ashley, and he did angles with Maria, and he did angles with, Stacy Keibler and Sable, and all these different women on television. And is he just acting out his, fantasies? To a degree, yes. To a degree, yes, he is. But it's fiction. It's not real. It's no different than when Quentin Tarantino puts himself into the movie, or no different than when Spike Lee puts himself into the movie. But you're in a situation where you're looking at this guy as being incredibly evil and using his power and authority to act out his sexual fantasies. But at the same way, this is what the character is openly doing. He's openly being licentious with these young women because that's what he feels a rich person, in some cases like a Hugh Hefner, would do. And unfortunately, it's very true because you see this with Bill Cosby and Jeffrey Epstein and Harvey Weinstein. And unfortunately, all these people are sex pests, and Vince is now among them, right? But in a sense, that is what the on-screen version of Mr. McMahon is based on, if it's not based on reality. But there's going to be some reality in it because the circumstances are still real. He's not just playing a rich and powerful man on television. That is what he is in real life. He's not just playing their boss on television. That is what he is in real life. So it's an interesting scenario. But just like Spike Lee once wrote himself to be a love interest in a movie, Vince McMahon writes himself to be a love interest on screen. And people have problems separating those two. While Vince doesn't feel like he does, some people feel like he does. Others feel like, okay, you're getting lost in the sauce, you're living the gimmick, And it's an interesting scenario because it's probably going to take a long time before we finally figure it out. Whether he's living the gimmick, which almost all of the evidence leans towards that he is, and that at some point, Mr. McMahon took over the real Vince McMahon's personality, and that's just who he is all the time now. And this guy who is, in a sense, eternally young, much like Vince McMahon himself, he doesn't really get old. And I think that he felt old and very mortal at one time. And this is why he wanted to kill the character off in 2007, right? It was because he started feeling old, started looking old. There wasn't enough hair dye in the world to cover all the grays. And the character had kind of maxed out in terms of what it could do. And he started trying to kill the character off and just be off screen again. It didn't quite work out that way. It took a little bit longer before Stephanie and Triple H were in a mature enough position as characters to take over. But that seemed to be the goal, is that at one point he was trying to kill Mr. McMahon. He was trying to get that character off television. And that needs to be taken into account too, because what made him decide, enough, Mr. McMahon? We've seen it. We've done enough. But there's still so much of it there that he popped back up to do something with Kevin Owens, or he popped back up to do something with, Roman Reigns, or he'll pop back up to do something with somebody else, so that the character could still have some life. And then he, popped back up in his last year, his grand goodbye, to do things with like Austin Theory and Pat McAfee and mix up and all that with Stone Cold Steve Austin one more time. And that had a great deal of nostalgia, but it often comes across like the last gasp of a man who thought that he would live forever, finding out that he is very much mortal. At the same time, though, there's still a beating heart in that body. And there's still so much that he feels like he has to do, or stuff that he can do. And sometimes he overrates his own capabilities. Like when he really botched that stunner, at WrestleMania 38. He really ruined that thing. And maybe he thought he could take a stunner at, what was he, 73 at the time, 74? And, he thought he could really take a stunner after having a match. But no, his body gave out on him. And he still had fun doing it. And that's the part of Vince that lives and that we see. And when you hear that he still has a ton of energy as an older guy who's almost 80. He still works out, still goes to the gym. He's still jacked. And you're like, how could this be? And you realize that, and he says this over and over again, he has an incredible zest for life. That's his reaction. This is why he still thinks about sex. Part of this could be steroid usage. Part of it could be hormonal imbalances, some kind of brain damage or whatever. But his zest for life leads him to say things like he doesn't believe in retirement. And that makes, again, normal people are like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, dude, you're way beyond the age of retirement. And Vince, when they talk about succession, and they've been talking about succession long before any of this stuff happened, he never really got into the subject. He never sat down and planned what would happen if he wasn't going to be there, because he never planned to not be there. That was the thing, and everybody knew that. Everybody said Vince will die in the chair. There's not a succession plan. The succession plan is you figure it out when I'm gone. That was the plan. Because he never planned to stop. And I like how he phrased it. He phrased it by saying, either you're growing or you're dying. So he has no sympathy for people who retire. He says, go die. Because at that point, you're not working anymore. You're not evolving. You're not adapting. You're not doing anything new. You're just rotting. But it sounds weird to the average person, but that's facts. It's absolute facts. If a plant isn't growing, it's dying. If a human being isn't growing, it's dying. When you stop growing, when you hit your peak and you start to regress and your skin starts to wrinkle, you're not growing anymore. You hit your physical peak and now you're starting to degrade, actually. But it sounds weird to people, who want and looking forward to being 65 and sitting around with their Social Security and, going to an old folks home or whatever. That's what they're looking forward to. But Vince is different. He doesn't look at it that way. He's not looking forward to that. He doesn't want that. So in a sense, he's trying to force himself to be young forever. Much like, again, fictional characters. That he doesn't change. He never changes. And this is why he, dyed his hair and grew that ridiculous mustache to try to look somewhat younger. And it's not going to work. He has to come to grips with his own mortality. He has to come to grips with reality. He's got to stop living the gimmick. He has fallen into Ric Flair territory, where Ric Flair is still wheeling and dealing, limousine riding, jet flying at 70 some odd years old. And when you see Ric Flair and he's in these commercials or whatever, and he's wooing and he can barely move, and you get a sense that this is a shell of Ric Flair. Why don't this guy just stop doing this stuff and go away? And Vince would, people say the same thing about him, like, just stop, go away. But he's like, well, if I go away, what will I do? Just go be a granddad? All his grandchildren are adults now. So, like, what is there to do? Except for you're telling them to go into a hole, lay down, and die. And he's not willing to do that. He's not willing to go away. He's not willing to give up his playground. He's not willing to come to grips with reality that he's a man who's almost 80 years old. And these situations that he finds himself in are very weird. And the world that he created, the bubble has been pierced to a degree. And now everything is coming across as being awkward. But this is what happens for years, like, to not to, overly equate these two things. But Diddy talked about having these parties for over 20 years, how famous his parties were. And now the government has turned the freak-off parties into a criminal activity. So now when you look at Diddy talking about parties in 1999, you're like, ugh. Now when you hear Diddy talk about throwing parties in 1995, you're like, ooh. When it was completely innocent. Everybody would go to a Diddy party. It takes on a new terminology. It takes on a new thought process with time. And a lot of stuff Vince McMahon did on screen takes on a different context once people start saying, oh, you're a sex trafficker or you're a rapist. And you see that in the perception of how some people are looking at the Attitude Era now. Oh, when Vince is doing stuff with Trish Stratus or he's doing something with Sable or whatever. Oh, this is the sexual harassment. He was throwing it in our faces the entire time. Like it's, found knowledge. When in reality, it's still the same thing it was yesterday. You're just looking at it through a different lens on purpose. Like, we don't know at what point Diddy's parties went from just being, industry soirees to being cult sex rituals or whatever. We don't know when that happened. And we're not sure when Mr. McMahon took over Vince McMahon and he started trying to use the roster or even some of the women who work in the office, even though he was already having sex with some of the women in the office. I think he had a sex with a secretary in like the 80s. But we don't know when he started turning that into the Playboy Mansion, where, all these women were for his personal use. We don't know when that started. But from a documentary's perspective, I really like hearing that this guy doesn't give up. He's not just going to go sitting on the porch with a little dog and drink orange juice every morning and not live his life. I really enjoy, because I've seen older people and what they really do is just sit near the window and nobody talks to them. Nobody cares about them. And when you see that kind of reality, you should appreciate somebody like Vince who's active. But then you want to say, how active should an 80-year-old man be? He shouldn't be having 40-year-old lovers, maybe. Maybe that's a little too active. At the same time, is it better for him to go sit and rot somewhere? No, it's not. There has to be a happy marriage between the two. So, another question that they asked him about his legacy, and he says he doesn't feel like he has one. And I don't know if he was being humble here, or was it he just doesn't think about it? Because again, he has this sort of sense of he's immortal, or he doesn't really care what people think about him. And he might legitimately be living his life in a way where he doesn't care what people think. And if that's the case, then he wouldn't be trying to protect his legacy. He doesn't really care about what it is. or I think he said on Pat McAfee that, he can't change people's perceptions of him. If people think that he's a bad person, then it is what it is. And he said in the documentary about the Rita Chatterton situation that once people think you're a rapist, then you're a rapist. And he doesn't try to fight those perceptions, but he doesn't argue with people about it, And it's also a very weird thing because you would think that, and back in the day, he did sue Rita Chatterton over it, but then he dropped the case. So it's not one of those things where he's just let that linger in the universe for years unrecognized. He planned to do something about it, but then, ring boy scandal, steroid scandal, all that stuff popped up at around the same time. He needed to save himself some money. So why waste the time and the money suing Rita Chatterton and Geraldo Rivera? It's just of levels of importance, dealing with the ring boy scandal was more important than that because it affected the company. And as we know through this documentary, Vince loves the company more than he cares about himself. And taking care of the steroid trial to keep himself out of prison, was more important than Rita Chatterton calling him a rapist on television because his freedom was at stake. And, when he was talking about being on trial for steroids and kind of going after the government, talking about the Department of Justice and how, Department of Justice is kind of shitty and all this kind of stuff. That was another one of those things where I was like, this old dude, he has so much fight in him. And the government offered him a plea and he refused to take it because he doesn't believe he did anything wrong. But at the same time, as he got older, of course, this became more of a problem. As he still doesn't believe he did anything wrong with any of these situations with these women that he paid out. And he didn't do the math on how much money he paid out in settlements or non-disclosure agreements. Maybe he didn't do the math on it. He has so much money, he probably didn't pay that no attention. But again, when you look at it from the outside, you're like, man, it's $12 million or something like that. That's kind of ridiculous. But to him, if it kept his name out of the media, it didn't embarrass his wife, which he cares a lot about. He cares about not embarrassing Linda. And this was something that, of course, he said in the Playboy interview when he talked about having affairs, and he talked about being discreet and not wanting to rub that stuff in Linda's face. So at the time, that's what he figured he's doing. He's going to pay these girls to be quiet and not talk about it, not write any books about it, not do any interviews about it, and it comes across because, again, people can't read the NDAs. We don't know what's in them, that these were all sexual assaults. These were all rapes, even though nobody said that. It's just that's the perception. And Vince doesn't fight that perception. So I guess he would fight these things individually, but the idea that he's discreet when it comes to Linda and his sexual proclivities, he'll live out his fantasies on television because, again, it's just not real. But then there's the element of him actually being licentious in real life and the blurring of the two. And of course, Janelle Grant's attorneys are talking about there's no difference between the two. It's like, well, in court, you're not going to be able to show a video of Vince McMahon making out with Sable and saying that in any way means that he's a sex trafficker. I'm pretty sure you're going to have to show footage or evidence of him sex trafficking in real life over sex trafficking on television or whatever the case may be. So it's an interesting scenario that you're dealing with when you're dealing with Vince. And he's not sure what his legacy is because he doesn't reflect too much. He doesn't have regrets. Like he says, he doesn't regret anything in his life because in his mind, he never did anything wrong, And of course, when you look back in history at, Owen Hart falling from the ceiling, you would think that would be something that he would regret. And he said he has no regrets in life because you can't change any of those things. And look, that's true. But like I said in a previous installment of this series, people want to hear human reactions. They want to hear an 80-year-old man sit back and say, you know, a guy died in the ring. I really wish we hadn't put that stunt together. You know, it's really sad. I wish we hadn't done that. But when you say I have no regrets, then people are like, wow, not even the guy falling from the ceiling? You don't even have any regrets about that? And I understand that you can't live your life second guessing your every move. But for human sake, people want to hear you say, a guy died, I wish that hadn't happened. Or, you know, some situation occurred, I wish that hadn't happened. But when you say you have no regrets and that you don't reflect on the past and you don't let failure, you know, allow a failure to fester, it makes you come across as being deeply, deeply, deeply detached from reality, to the point where you live in a fictional world where these people are not real and they're just characters, and characters come and they go. Owen Hart was a character who fell from the ceiling and now that character is gone. That's not what people want to hear. That makes you sound psychotic. That was when you see everybody saying that he's evil. That sounds evil. That sounds like you absolutely do not care about other human beings. And if you don't care about other human beings, of course you would abuse women. Of course you would be abusive towards talent. Of course you would, you know, pay them below market rate or whatever the case may be. You wouldn't pay them appropriately. You would exploit people because you have no function to understand their humanity. So this was a big miss in terms of humanizing Vince. Vince was more humanized on Pat McAfee when he was sort of reflective. And he seemed to be a lot looser with Pat than he was in this documentary. You know, so if you're trying to get a sense of who Vince McMahon is, this documentary didn't do him any favors. Now, do I think it's deceptive editing? No, because part of it is what Vince saying what he thinks and then other people responding. You know, it's not just, oh, they deceptively edited this thing to make him look bad. It's also Vince says things that make him look bad. You know, and maybe those are deceptively edited. His comments, perhaps. We don't know. But the documentary did not give you too much about Vince McMahon, the man. You know, you get a lot about the character, you get a lot about the situations he finds himself in and his reactions to those situations, but they're not human reactions. You know, the only time he gets emotional is when he talks about his father passing. Other than that, he's basically trying to explain situations and not giving you any insight into his thought process about why he, you know, didn't close the show for Owen Hart. He just kind of responds to it like, well, the people didn't come to see anybody die. They came to see a show. It's like, but Vince, you know, humanize this thing a little bit. You know, guy fell from the ceiling. We want to hear your thought process about why the show went on. You know, when you hear about all the wrestlers dying, we want you to reflect a little bit. Recognize that how difficult the schedule might be. You know, how these guys work through injury. This is what we want to hear. But he doesn't say what you know, because he doesn't care about what you want to hear. And that makes him sound worse. And maybe that's really how he feels. Is that he has no responsibility for these guys who died. That's not his problem. You know, these guys did things on their own time. In his mind, they're independent contractors. More so, they're also full-grown adults. And they're responsible for their own safety and their own behaviors. Which, you know, circles back to that extreme self-ownership that Vince McMahon essentially was talking about. Where he won't allow himself the blame of any negative behaviors falls on his abuse as a child. He doesn't allow Chris Benoit the excuse of CTE. So he's not going to allow the Mr. Perfect or Eddie Guerrero the excuse of, well, the wrestling business drove me to take painkillers and die. And to be quite honest, that's inhuman. It's inhuman because when a bunch of wrestlers are conking out at 40, somebody should wake up and say, well, look, this is problematic. It's the lifestyle of the performers. It's too many guys for it to just be a personal failing. It has to be the lifestyle or the culture around the business. And some of these guys, because they were all in the same age bracket when they died, they come from the same generation, the same era, where the drugs and the steroids and stuff like that were more prevalent. And it was the culture of that time that led to guys dying young at that time. And that's something that you would be willing to reflect on and mention and talk about. But Vince doesn't do that, because you didn't see a bunch of wrestlers dying at 40 before 1980. There wasn't a ton of wrestlers conking out from heart attacks at 40. It started during the rock and wrestling era. It started in the 80s, where everybody started doing cocaine and painkillers recreationally. And there was an entire culture of wrestling where guys were doing that. They were doing it in Texas, where a lot of those guys died, like Gino Hernandez. And, the Von Erichs started doing drugs and a bunch of stuff there. And it was happening all over the country. The Junkyard Dog, he came in from Louisiana. He had a drug problem. So it was prevalent in the 80s and in the 90s for these guys to experiment with drugs and alcohol to keep up the schedule so that they can work. That was the culture of the time. You're being asked this question, and if you're Vince, you should be able to reflect on that. But because he's not human, and maybe he's a guy with multiple computers in his head, like he says, he's getting defensive about it. And now he's 80 and he's still kind of defensive about it. And that's not really helpful. When everybody was scared that the documentary would humanize him and that the documentary would make him seem like a normal, average guy. But it just showed how abnormal he was. It was a piercing of the veil where you see that the thought process in the world of Vince McMahon is not the same as the thought process in the world of normal people. That he is in the realm of like Michael Jackson and Willy Wonka and Hugh Hefner, who have crafted their own realities within our reality. And we don't understand anything that's going on in there. And when somebody steps out and says, there's a lot of foul stuff going on in there, we tend to believe it. We tend to look and be like, yeah, you know what? You're probably right. And while it's perfectly normal to them, what's going on in there, it ain't normal to us. And Vince McMahon is abnormal, looking at it from the outside in. And if you lived with him for 40 or 50 years, you probably say, oh, well, that's just kind of how Vince is. But other people who don't know him, and this documentary was supposed to be about getting to know him, and he denies you the access of knowing who he is. He won't talk about his childhood. There's a bunch of things that he will not discuss, that he won't share. He's even laughs at, not telling people real stories about things that happened to him or things that he was involved with. You come across with only what he wants you to see, which is that he is cold, distant, and abnormal. And that's reason enough for people to say that he should be in prison. You can't walk away from this thing thinking like this kindly old grandfather wouldn't do the stuff that this woman said that he would do in this lawsuit. You're looking at it and you're saying Vince is 70 some odd years old. He still thinks about sex. He's still going to the gym. He still works out. He's in better shape than most 80-year-old men. And you're like, I can see it. You putting the thought in people's heads that you are what the public perception of you is. And that's because you have fallen into the gimmick. And now Mr. McMahon is all people see. Like, share, subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later.